Okay, first of all, I would like to welcome all of you for this ceremony and this conference, very important, in this temple of science and of architecture. Look, for instance, I have two globes on the right and left. They are one of the larger globes in the world, being the largest one in Paris, and they are dated at the end of 17th century and represent the celestial and terrestrial globes. I suggest you, during the coffee break, if c'è un coffee break.
There will be two coffee breaks and a lunch break.
During the coffee break, to have a look at the two globes, because it is relevant to know what is the situation of that period concerning the evaluation of skies and Earth. Well, coming back to Accademia. Accademia is a very old institution, was born at the end of the 18th century, specifically in 1783, and was born due to three very important persons representing the civil society at that time. The three persons are a nobleman, Saluzzo di Monbasilio, a physician, Cigna, and a very famous mathematician, Lagrange. The bustes of these three persons are back. Which is the role, the goal of Accademia, starting at that period, is to promote, to support research, not only to promote the research itself, but also to use research to develop the society, to help the government to create a new effective society, civil society. And I suppose that is what we need today. However, let me say, just to represent some aspects of Accademia. Accademia has a lot of members. The number of members today is about 400, and the majority of the members are national members and international members. However, in the past, we have had a lot of very famous members, including 26 Nobel Prizes, 3 field medals, and even an emperor, because when Napoleon occupied the Piedmont, he wanted to become the president of Accademia of Torino, due to the relevance of Accademia in Europe. Okay, today our role is to support research, to support science, and to have the possibility to support also the development of society and to defend the role of science in society. I am very happy, I am proud to host this very important ceremony, and I thank you very much. I wish you a good stay in Accademia and in Torino.
So, good morning, everybody. I'm Alessandro Vercelli. I'm the director of the National Institute of the Neuroscience Institute of Turin, and which is an interdepartmental center for neuroscience in Turin. I have to say that the University of Torino has a long-standing interest in neuroscience. Many prominent scientists were teaching in Torino. In the past, I just remember, for example, Rolando, who was teaching anatomy and physiology here in Torino. And I think that this event is a very important event for our university, and for this I really thank Marco Tamietto, who is a prominent scientist of our university, for organizing it, as well as he did in the past also in other occasions. And I hope that this is one of a long series, because it is very important to open our university to the world and to the prominent scientists around the world. The Emotional Brain is the title of one of the books by Joseph LeDoux. And I think that the emotional part of our brain is very relevant. And just for this, I would like to cite a famous, to quote Rita Levi-Montalcini, who a few years ago said about this, unfortunately, much of our behavior is still driven by the archaic brain. All the great tragedies, the Shoah, wars, Nazism, and racism, are due to the prevalence of the emotional component over the cognitive one. And the archaic brain is so adept that it makes us think that all this is controlled by our thinking, where it is not so. So I think that perhaps there will be much more than this during this meeting, but it's important to know the emotional part of our brain in order to master it and to have to use it at the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandro. We now proceed to the Laudatio, which is divided in three speakers, essentially Professor Maya Gazzaniga, and then Professor Daniele Schiller, and a little bit of myself too.
So good morning. We're here on a grand occasion, and I thought I'd tell you some points. In the academic world, there are scientists of all kinds, teachers and communicators of all kinds, and scholars of all kinds. There are, in fact, many great scientists who actually have a hard time getting their story across, and there are many great communicators who actually don't have much to say. Today we're honored with Joseph LeDoux from New York University, who's truly a great scientist and scholar and a great communicator. He has the magic combination, as we like to say, a truly first-rate jockey on a first-rate horse. And he has been that way out of the gate ever since I've known him. It was almost 40 years ago when Joe walked into my lab as a young, restless, creative, vigorous, and endlessly curious student. From that first day until the present, he has been staying true to his vision and lights. After doing seminal work on split-brain patients, he decided to study the emotional basis of emotions, and the rest, as they say, is history. In paper after paper, and in a series of scholarly books, he reported his work. What is important, as his scholarly work, which you'll be hearing about in detail today, is Joe's generosity of heart and adventurous spirit, He also has a willingness to challenge norms, yet always abide by the data in all of its detail. These are the factors that make a person whole. And Joe, I have a new nickname for you after hearing your wonderful concert last night. J-Led has it all. Today, Joseph, we salute you.
Good morning. My job is to talk about Joe as a mentor. So I decided to take the evidence-based approach, and I contacted some more than 20 of his prior trainees and asked them to give us a sentence of what Joe meant to them as a mentor. So here are a few highlights. This is from Thomas. He says that one of the things that most inspired him about Joe is this aspect of the Renaissance man, his gift and determination to make things work and to reach people with ideas he believed in. Jacek said that Joe is a multidimensional person, sensitive and passionate, with courage to take risks and go beyond known trails, but also full of self-restraint. Hillary remembers that Joe had her back when she was a very insecure and shy second-year graduate student, and he was there for her to save her from a very embarrassing moment. Greg Kirk said that Joe always knew what I needed and always knew where I was headed. Sometimes he knew better than I knew myself. You can't ask for a better mentoring than that. Glenn Schaaf said that Joe is without question the reason he had a career in academia. Joe took a chance on him at a stage of his career when he didn't have to take a chance. Claudia is a veteran in Joe's lab. She says that the trait she admires most is the respect and kindness with which he treats others. No matter how well known and successful he became, he's still the same down-to-earth person that she met 32 years ago. And you still start her whole when you open the door to her lab. Mian is also a veteran in Joe's lab. He says that it's kind of embarrassing to mention how long he's been working in Joe's lab, but he wouldn't have stayed there for 23 years if he wasn't super kind and considerate the whole time. Without a doubt, he's not only a great scientist and a vast mind, but a very humble and caring person with integrity. Rafi also says hi, says that Joe is a great mentor who knows to listen and always has an advice. Chris Kane says that he thinks deeply about the mind and brain, is not afraid to take risks, and still remains open to new data that may challenge his views. Torfi says he gave us all inspiring big ideas and also the freedom to pursue them. Raquel says that he always had a clever insight about the data. Rob told me that by the end of graduate school he was unable to see the forest of the trees, and Joe helped him, and the advice he gave him is that never to forget the human problem you're trying to solve. Francisco says that his unparalleled ability to explain complex scientific ideas by choosing the best yet simplest word to make ideas accessible to everyone. This ability seems to stem from his enjoyment on deeply analyzing the nature of the mind. And he has mastered this skill such that it seems to come to him effortlessly. And Karim says something along the same lines, only in Karim's way. Joe is a scientific tour de force. How often does a kick from the Big Easy takes over the emotional scientific universe? But also mentions that Joe is a contemporary thinker devoted to bringing the modern day language into our jargon-loaded scientific terms. And he knew that big science is best described in the simplest terms. Just a few more that are very moving. Josh Johansson, who's now in Japan, sent his wishes and saying that, Joe's intellectual framework has inspired him, but really it was his humanity that struck him most when he was working in the lab. And when he started his own lab, the advice that Joe gave him is to always have patience with people, because people need to work through stuff to be their best. And this is the advice he took with him when he's establishing his own lab now in Japan. John says that when he was in the lab, Joe was this chill chief of operations that created the optimal environment for excellence. And finally, I thought it would be appropriate to finish with Joe's first graduate student. She said it was a learning experience for both of them. And he was a pretty casual person, but what struck her most is that he could read anywhere, in every situation, even like on the floor in the operation room and wherever they were. And he could start a story by, I was standing in line at a grocery store reading this book, and she's like, who reads a book in the line to the grocery store? And she says that it was always his ability to devote this singular burning focus to whatever he was working at the present moment that made him a really great scientist. So this is the evidence, but we don't need machine learning, a sophisticated machine learning algorithm to see how the evidence clusters and tells us what are really the driving factors that describe Joe as a mentor. And I think we can clearly see that he's just a kind, humble, and caring human being. He's a deep thinker and eloquent writer. And just to give you one concrete example, once I came to Joe and said, like, why don't we write a song about refractory time? And, something like I lost my job in the factory, I'm now in refractory. And Joe said, yeah, I'm on it. And within a few days, he came up with this really beautiful poetic song that just describes, in very simple but deep terms, of what is the refractory gap. It's, when nerves fire, and then they wait and they can't fire again until another state. It's a thing called refractory time, and it dictates the speed of the mind. I'm here in a dictar place. I'm in this lonely refractory space. I need to go out beyond the gap. And the phrase I like most is that it's this thing called refractory time. It's where I spend my time. And I think we can all identify with that. And finally, Joe is also someone who does science meticulously, relentlessly, but also with creativity and a sense of adventure. I mean, how else would you start studying a small region of the brain with a very simple process and end up spearheading the whole field? Maybe just as you would write a really simple song, this is the first song of the amygdaloid, but you will end up playing it in front of 10,000 people in Madison Square Garden. This is how Joe pursues his dreams and inspires us all. This is Joe as a mentor. Thank you, Joe. So Colin Dempsey from Joe's band will say a few words.
Hello, my name is Colin. I'm a friend of Joe. I'm not a scientist. I'm a normal person. I have a regular job. I have an engineering background, so I do understand most of what you talk about. Joe just asked me to say a few words. Dr. LeDoux sounds very interesting. He has books and he's done a lot of work. I don't know that man. I'm friends with Joe, and I play music with Joe. And I travel the world with Joe, and we drink together, we have food together, and we play shows and stuff like this. And the one thing I've noticed about Joe is that he's very warm, very creative, very dedicated, very intelligent, and he has a passion for music and creativity, which inspires me as a musician also. And you don't actually see that a lot with professional musicians. He has a kind of a childlike addiction to creativity, and it's something that I find very inspirational. Because as a musician, you can have moments where you dip a little bit, and Joe's always aggressive. He's always pushing. So I don't know. I don't have the science background, but what I can tell you is that when I first went on a trip with Joe, we went to Eunice in Louisiana, and we had breakfast, and we had beer, and we had sausages. And I says, I'm going to be friends with this guy. I like this guy. So all I can tell you is that from somebody who works with him in the music and the creative side is that Dr. LeDoux obviously is a very important man. I highly recommend you get to know Joe, because I only know Joe. I'm not a scientist, and I'm friends with this man. And if any opportunity you have to sit down and have a beer with Joe, I recommend it. That's it. Thank you very much.
It is my pleasure to add a few thoughts concerning Joe and his outstanding scientific achievements, and to speak in front of such a distinguished audience after Mike and Daniela? Well, consider this picture appear in 2012 in a paper entitled, "What's the most interesting part of a brain?" Well, actually the paper is a bit of a joke, and I think the real title should have been, "What's the most popular part of a brain?" In red you see regions that correlates with high impact factor journals and citations, and below the corresponding topics and keywords. Region in emotional processing turned stellar performances. Well, to put facts in perspective, consider that some 30 years ago, when Joe started his seminal studies, emotion or fear were barely legitimate topics of scientific inquiry in neuroscience. And with a few exceptions, the amygdala was a small, anonymous structure buried deeply into the temporal lobes. Joe's work on the neural circuitry of threat responses determined to a great extent what is present in this picture now. So more formally, if you wish, his studies provided paradigm shift in contemporary neuroscience and paved the way to establish a new field that is now referred to as affective neuroscience. But let's go back to the beginning of the story. Well, my connection with Joe dates back to late 90s, when I was an undergraduate student, and I did not even know that I existed in this world. As a student, I was interested in two topics in neuroscience: consciousness, on one hand, or more precisely, breakdown of consciousness that can occur in neuropsychological conditions like a split brain, blind sight, unilateral neglect, and emotion, on the other hand. As for consciousness, I was suggested to read Larry Weisskran's book, Consciousness Lost and Found, while concerning emotion, I was pointed to the emotional brain of Joe, of course. And in this book, I found what became, in its simplicity, the most influential diagram guiding essentially my future research and my future studies: the famous distinction between low road and high road to the amygdala. I wanted to integrate the study on emotions with blind sight, and I had the proverbial beautiful idea: test whether blind sight patients could discriminate above chance emotional expressions. Well, to my disappointment, the phenomenon had already been discovered by Bert de Gelder and Larry in a series of studies between the end of the 90s and the beginning of 2000, where Joe's influence was clearly acknowledged, as you can read in this quote: "The presence of parallel visual system in the brain, one subserving automatic, non-conscious fear processing, the other subserving conscious identification and discrimination, are consistent with this view, LeDoux 1996, that the amygdala may be crucial for this integrative processing." When I recovered from the news that somebody already did what I wanted to do, I spent most of my research time trying to characterize the properties of this subcortical pathway to the amygdala in humans. There is now compelling evidence that the subcortical visual pathway exists in human and non-human primates and is fast in responding to coarse and unconsciously perceived emotional expressions, very much in line with what Joe discovered in the auditory domain of rodents years before. Second round, second try for me. In late 80s, beginning of the 90s, there was evidence that patients with unilateral neglect could process pre-attentively and without awareness complex visual information up to the semantic level. For example, the classic burning house experiment by Marshall and Halligan, the study by Berti and Rizzolatti, or the works of John Driver. So I thought that it might have been an interesting study to explore how emotional expressions compete for attention and influence awareness. But then again, the beautiful studies by Patrick Villemier were published Again, they were inspired by previous works of Joe. And again, I had to find my way through a narrower path, studying with Bea the impact of bodily expression on neglect. So now I can confess. One of the main reasons to organize the symposium today in honor of Joe is to induce all these great scientists that I admire and who unwittingly sense my ideas before I can realize them, to convene in the same place, the same day, at the same time, and lock them in for a year or more so that I can do my research in a bit more relaxed way. Finally, in the last years, Joe has been doing a refined analysis of the relationship between emotion and consciousness, defining taxonomies and clarifying semantics implications of the often confusing consequences, or when we refer to subjective states over behaviors or measurable physiological responses with the same words. This work has also involved Richard Brown, who cannot be here today, but we have a hello message from him, and is inspired by higher order theories of consciousness to which Hak-Won Lau contributed very prominently. So being here today, for me, really means closing circles. Closing the circle through low road of music and rock and roll, as we did yesterday night, and through the high roads of science, as we're doing now. Based on all we discussed so far, I'm sure it is clear and undisputed why, in a few minutes, as soon as I shut up, Joe LeDoux will receive 2 honorary fellowships as member of the Department of Psychology and of the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Turin. But before proceeding to the awards ceremony, please let me thank once again the Academy of Science of Torino for hosting us today, the Department of Psychology and the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Turin for supporting this event. And thank you so much to all the great speakers of today who found time in their busy agenda, traveled from all over the world to come here and pay tribute to Joe, the scientist, the friend, and the musician. Thank you. Psychology and